All right, good morning again. So it was pointed out to me yesterday that somebody actually noticed what's going on the website, because down on that bottom right where all the upcoming Dharma talks are announced, my list of upcoming Dharma talks all say suffering and the end of suffering. The reason for that is twofold. The first is, and the practical one is, I usually don't know what I'm going to talk about until 2 or 3 days ahead of when I come in and talk, so there's not a lot of point in saying more than that. But the other reason is, that is what I talk about. It's suffering and the end of suffering. Buddha said, I teach two things. I teach about suffering and I teach about the end of suffering. And the word he used, of course, wasn't an English word, it was dukkha, which we translate as suffering, and it's familiar as suffering, but really what that word is about, dukkha is separation. Separation from others, separation from who we really are, separation from peace, from just being peace. So Buddha said, I teach about this suffering, and I teach about how to bring that to an end, which is how to come together in oneness with everything. And that's not the loss of, it's not this mushy smush where everything just comes together and you've got pulp. There is separateness in the identity, but it's how to come together and about finding true peace, the peace of God which passeth all understanding. So that's my aspiration, is to talk about that meaningfully, right? And the way I'm going to approach that today is something some of you heard me talk about this on Thursday. I recited a piece on Thursday and then we talked about it, and one topic we spent quite a bit of time on was useless projects. So I'm going to talk about useless projects today. And for clarity, what that is not about, it is not about not engaging in the world. It's really easy to say, I'm going to give up projects, I'm going to go sit in a cave. This is not about going and sitting in a cave and disengaging. This is about useless projects, and we'll talk about those words. Pai Chang in the Zen tradition famously said, I think the story is something along the lines, he was getting old and his fellow monastics were feeling like, well, he shouldn't be working as hard as he is, we need to give him a break. So he wouldn't stop, so they took his hoe and hid it away. And he just refused to eat. He said, a day without work is a day without food. He didn't eat, so they gave him his hoe back and he started working again. And it's there in all of our faith traditions, it's there in our lives. We're here in this incarnation, and as long as we're in this meat suit, sack of skin and bones, whatever you want to call it, we're in the world and we engage with the world. So it's not about pulling away, it's about what it means to be in the world. So I'll repeat, or I won't repeat, I will recite the first part of this so you know the context, and then we'll just focus on a section of it. It's by a Tibetan teacher, his name's Patrul Rinpoche, and it is from the 19th century. His title for this was Advice from Me to Myself. And I'm going to personalize it to me for an obvious reason. Listen up, old bad karma Gareth, you dweller in distraction. For ages now you've been beguiled, entranced, and fooled by appearances. Are you aware of it? Are you? Right now, when you're under the spell of mistaken perception, you've got to watch out. Your mind is running around about completing a lot of useless projects. It's a waste. Give it up. It goes on, and he talks about plans and projects and lots of other things. Your mind is constantly spinning around about completing a lot of useless projects. It's a waste. Give it up. That's what I want to focus on. So projects. What's a project? What are we supposed to be giving up here? Projects. A project for me, I'll pick one. Zelda. It's one of those video games. I actually mentioned it before here. I read in, this was actually Andrew Holacek, who's an American practitioner in the Tibetan tradition, and he talked about he does a lot of his teachings around illusory form, and this is all illusory and dreams are illusory. He said a way of really landing on that is to just create new environments for yourself. So play video games, because if you can be mindful and aware when you're in a video game environment, it's just another reality. Immerse yourself in that reality and realize it, and that is illusory in the same way this is illusory. That's cool. It asked me to pull out an old crutch and start playing video games again, so I did. And it was fun. It was interesting and it was fun. And then I realized it was becoming a project. Because there's the end of the game, you've got to master the skills and the 15 different things you've got to do with your thumbs and your different fingers, and then there's all the little puzzles, and then there's the side quests, and it's convoluted. And the next thing after this is the next video game. So it just becomes a project. Fortunately, I was able to see that before I became too addicted to it, and I just gave the whole thing to my son. So end of project. One thing that Beth and I have spent quite a bit of time talking about recently, and I think Beth is increasingly realizing where my energy around this comes from. I use this particular verse a lot. So this is informing how I approach life in general. But there's a number of projects we've just given up. Bees, I keep bees, and that's fading, and the garden, lots of things. I've got a piano downstairs. It's in Beth's studio. I keep on thinking I'm going to bring that up and start playing again. But I know where I am right now. If I do that, it's several years since I played the piano. I have to start learning my scales. I'd have to get out my Hanon and start doing my finger exercises, start learning a few pieces. I'd want to get to where I had a decent repertoire of half a dozen pieces I was more than passingly competent at. It will just become a project. And I am not taking on any more projects right now. I'm trying to get rid of projects. This because it's just a project. These are all projects. Your mind is spinning around about taking on a lot of useless projects. What's this word useless all about? I'm talking about useless projects because, ironically, I think it's useful. Why do I think it's useful? Because it helps move us in the direction of the end of suffering. And underneath that, there's another way of looking at this, which I also think is very useful, which is it skillful? And those two kind of go together to me. Is it useful? Is it skillful? Or ending of suffering and being skillful. So this is not to say we'll get to this in a little bit. For right now, this is not to say there are no useful projects. This is about giving up the useless projects. So what are these useless projects? Well, I've just given you a few that I think are useless. But what are the general attributes here of useless projects? Do they help end suffering? Do they help reduce suffering? And are they a skillful way of engaging ourselves in the world to move towards the end of suffering? That to me is the test. The line before, though, I think is a really crucial line as we look to this. Your mind is spinning around about a lot of useless projects. Your mind is spinning around. If this becomes a story, part of the problem with the piano thing is it was going to become a story, because it was not going to be, I don't have the skills right now to just sit and play for 2 hours and just be in that place and then come back out. It becomes a project because there's a lot of stories about how I've got to get there. Somebody on Thursday was talking about growing tomatoes. Growing tomatoes is kind of cool. Actually, I won't go to tomatoes. I'll go to the bees. No, I won't. I'll go to the bees. It'll be an analogous one, and then it's clearly my story. So keeping bees is kind of cool. Starts off as we're going to keep bees, which is going to be my contribution to sustaining bees in this country, which are very much at risk. It's also going to be my contribution to local natural plant fertilization, pollination. I'm going to get some honey out of there, and I'm going to give honey to my friends. So there's a lot of cool things coming out of this. But as I go in there, bees are not as simple to maintain as you would like. they get these things called varroa mites, which are they are ticks that live on bees. And the way they procreate within bee colonies, if you're not careful, you'll reach a tipping point, and then they are not just problems in themselves, they are vectors of disease, so all your bees get sick. And then towards the end of the season, the bee colony shrinks dramatically in size, the varroa mite concentration grows, the disease concentration grows, and the hive collapses. Dead bees, lots of dead bees. So there are ways to manage this, and there are sustainable ways which don't require, poisoning the colony and so forth, but they require work. Just day to day, there's routine stuff that requires work. Lots of planning, lots of interfering in other things. It's a project. And then you step back even from that, and bees are necessary, honeybees are actually necessary in this country to sustain pollination of non-native species, because honeybees are European. They are not a native species to this country. So it doesn't take long to step back from this project and spot an awful lot of elements that suggest this is not really as useful as I thought it was. In actual fact, there's elements in it that rapidly become harmful. So the mind is spinning around. Suffering and the end of suffering. The end of suffering is for myself and for others. It's for all beings equally. All beings equally. Which requires taking down the boundary between self and other and acting with compassion, equanimity, joy, wishing happiness for all beings. It's what we talk about at the Brahma Viharas or metta practice. So it's the boundary coming down between self and other. If the mind is spinning around, there's a story going on, there's a boundary, there's a barrier there. The barrier has to come down, the thoughts have to stop in order for me to truly enter into that relationship, truly enter into that action with other beings. As long as I'm engaged in projects, I'm thinking about these things, and I'm not really immersed in relieving suffering. Now there's an edge there, right? Because we're in these sacks of skins and bones, when we're wandering around as people. To act in the world, there has to be some planning. But then, and it's complicated in the world we live in today, because we created all these social structures, a lot of which are filling out bits of paper, which is now keying a bunch of stuff in online. But if you go back, let's just say 2,500 years, there was a guy in northern India who established the traditions, that guy right there. He established the tradition that we're all sitting in right here, Buddhism. He used to get up, sit in the morning, and then he'd go wandering around the village, and he'd carry his bowl, and he'd knock on 7 doors, and if he got food, he'd eat, and if he didn't, he wouldn't. And all the monks would go out and they'd ask for food, and they'd come back and they'd share the food among themselves. There was no storing. Intentionally no storing. This comes down to us today in the Theravadan tradition, the viharas that a lot of Theravadan monks live in, monks and nuns live in. They don't store food there. They don't handle money. You go to Japan, there's the tradition of takuhatsu, I think it's called, which is very slowly walking down the street with a bowl. Heavily robed, big hats, all sorts of stuff, but it's the same basic principle. There's no storing. It's a complete letting go. Jesus in the Beatitudes said, oh goodness, I always misquote this one. It's, look at the birds of the air, they do not worry about tomorrow. I will provide for them. It's hard to take that as a code for daily living in our world, but to recognize that as a possibility, that as a general direction, I think can be really, really powerful. Now, in our daily life, yeah, you can have, a few, a bunch of mylar bags and 5-gallon food quality storage containers, and you can have a whole bunch of beans and rice in the basement and not worry about it. And then when the apocalypse happens, invite all your neighbors in and come on, we got some food, share it out. So there are some ways of, positioning yourself to truly help other people. But to spend all that time and energy and all that thought effort and all that distraction and all that project work to create a few jars of honey to give people, that's not about relieving suffering. That's about me making friends. Let's be honest what that's about. And it would be cheaper, easier, take much less time if I just went up to, one of these like natural honey stores, and there's several in town, and bought a bunch of jars of honey. So it's the mind is spinning around about taking on a lot of useless projects. How to stay engaged in the world without the mind spinning around and without creating projects. On Wednesday evening, we are starting a book by Joanna Macy, which is World as Love, a World as Self. It's a book, it's the current version of a book that was first written maybe 30 years ago, maybe longer than that, it's been a while. And the premise of the book is, it's about climate change and environmental degradation and sex extinction and so forth. It's about the degradation of the world we're living in and how we live in that. And as it relates to what I'm talking about today, I would suggest that if we take that on as personalizing the suffering, the problem, the harm, personalizing how to solve it, creating stories about how to solve it, starting to design solutions, create projects, build long-term plans, we're going to get ourselves in a mess. Now, if we happen to be a Joanna Macy or a Mahatma Gandhi, then there's a natural way that karma moves into the world and just coalesces activity around it. One of you may be that person, I'm not. So it's foolish for me to kind of put myself in that kind of role. For every person who is in that role, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people who say, that's good. Let me just sign up and do a little bit of that. And then for everyone who does that, there are probably hundreds or thousands more who drive past the Chattahoochee Nature Reserve and recognize that's a lovely place. And the world would be a better place if one extra person went in once a month and spent an hour picking up debris from the side of the river. So this is not about not acting in the world, but it's about finding our place in that activity naturally, and doing so in a very natural, connected and engaged way, which necessarily means doing it without a whole bunch of storytelling. And it comes back to something you've heard me say before, which is, at the end of the day, we are all here right now. We know this, right? And we have a choice right now, and right now, and right now, and every right now about what we're going to do. And the choice is what's skillful, what can I do right now that will help reduce suffering, that is skillful. And there are so many ways of doing that without creating all these projects. And if we can land in that place, it is a much more peaceful, and therefore peaceful for us, and therefore much more effective, because that peace radiates out. That's the nature of peace, that affects everybody and everything around.